Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Talking X's and O's with Alex and Tyler. We're super excited to be back this week after a lot of crazy games took place last week. Obviously there was a lot of blowouts that happened, but Tyler, out of all of them, which one shocked you the most?
Honestly, I would say the one that shocked me the most was probably I would say the Bears and Jaguars, honestly. The Lions and Cowboys, the Cowboys really haven't been playing spectacular. Saints, had a backup quarterback with some injuries on their team, but the Jaguars and the Bears, I don't think a lot of people took the Bears seriously with, Caleb Williams and how they've been performing, but to go out there and throw four touchdowns against the Jaguars defense and to win 35-16, I think that shows that the Bears offense isn't one to mess around with, especially with their defense playing as well as it is. But that's definitely one that I think shocked me the most this week.
Yeah, the Bears looked really good. Obviously, they got the win. 35-16 was the final score. And like you mentioned, Caleb Williams played great. And, this is something to take note of. I think that the Bears offense is really kind of working together at this point. They've had a few games to kind of build a relationship and just kind of get in their groove. And it seems like they're in it right now. So it's going to be interesting, especially because they have a really good defense. So that was a really great game to watch. It was super early, but it was fun to watch. And then obviously, one that I found to be interesting was the Buccaneers Saints. The Buccaneers ran away with it 51-27, and that one really shocked me. Obviously Spencer Rattler came in as and played quarterback after being drafted, and then obviously after Derek Carr got injured, but it really shocked me. I really thought it would be a closer game. I don't know about if I thought it would be a high scoring game or a low scoring, but I really did not expect it to be that much of a difference. And then obviously, I was proved wrong.
Yeah, I think a lot of people had more expectations for the Saints to, put up a fight against the Buccaneers, especially with how the Saints defense has, somewhat been producing. But, watching this game, it really feels like the Saints just completely fell apart after the first 2 games of the season, and, looking back at it, your first 2 wins, you beat the Panthers week 1, you beat the Cowboys week 2, both in blowout fashion. You lose 4 straight games. I don't know if it's something with, injuries or if it's something with, play call decisions or whatever the case may be, because we've obviously seen that this offense has potential to play great, but maybe we just overshadow the fact that maybe they're just playing some, really bad teams or, very just lackluster teams the first 2 weeks. But for them to come out and then get absolutely blown out at home, especially against a divisional rival, that's not something you want to see. And especially, with the Buccaneers not having Rashad White and having to rely on Bucky Irving and Sean Tucker. Sean Tucker just ran away with the game, and I don't think anyone's even heard of this guy until this week when he became, the NFC Offensive Player of the Ground or whatever the case was when he won that reward. But he really had himself a game this week. Fantasy players who saw him on the waiver, 34 points or something ridiculous like that. 136 yards in the ground, 56 yards in the air, 2 touchdowns. Just that kind of production from the Buccaneers is something that Buccaneer fans want to see, especially with the direction they're moving into the playoffs. Baker Mayfield's playing at an MVP level with all the production he's been doing, but throwing 3 interceptions, that's something that the Saints should have been able to produce more points off, and unfortunately it just didn't happen. And granted, you have Spencer Rattler starting his first game as a rookie, but just very poor performance by the Saints.
Yeah, and at first it seemed like Spencer Rattler was actually producing and doing pretty good, but then the Bucks just kind of ran away with it. And like you mentioned, it was very good for the Bucks. Obviously, maybe not so good for Baker Mayfield and his interceptions, but Chris Godwin played a great game, and I'm sure you know that you have him on your fantasy team. So
I still lost with him. Doesn't matter.
Okay, moving on. We're gonna go on to the Packers Cardinals. Obviously, it was a sad one for us. The Cardinals fell 34 to 13, and it was pretty sad because, heading into this game, I kind of thought that obviously the Packers would win with Jordan Love and Josh Jacobs, and they've just been playing pretty well this season, even after Jordan Love was out a few games at the beginning of the season due to an injury. He came back and looked like nothing ever happened. He looked like he's been there the entire season. And obviously, the Cardinals just kind of, there was a lot of things wrong with them. Marvin Harrison got injured with a concussion, which he was taken out of the game, obviously. And then the Packers defense really just made a lot of moves, and then the Cardinals defense really just kind of, they didn't do anything.
Yeah, and it's really just poor offensive play calling, and, maybe there's some, you know, play decisions and playmaking that was involved with the poor well, I shouldn't say maybe, there definitely was some poor playmaking in the game against the Green Bay Packers. I mean, 3 fumbles in 1 game, that's not something you're gonna win football games with. I mean, James Conner fumbled, Greg Dortch fumbled, then to cap the game off, Kyler Murray fumbles the ball, which I wouldn't even credit him a fumble. It was more of a botched handoff between him and, Trey Benson, but the whole game just felt very out of hand. I mean, from the start, the first quarter and a half, 35 yards of total offense for the Cardinals, you're down 24 nothing, and then you get a touchdown finally with Michael Benson or with Michael Wilson, but it's at the point where, something has to change with this offensive play calling, whether it be relying more on the passing attack, creating more passing opportunities with, different route trees or whatever the case may be, because we've seen this Cardinal team. I mean, they run the ball and they run it well, but when the run game isn't there, their whole team falls apart. And we've seen this week in and week out. We've seen it, where the run game didn't work against the Lions. We saw where it didn't work against the Commanders. We saw where it didn't work this week against the Packers. And when it fails, I feel like Drew Petzing doesn't really know what to do from there. I mean, he goes to try to make passes and play decisions that just aren't there. And you know, props for Trey McBride for stepping up as I guess, wide receiver 1 for the Cardinals, making 8 receptions, 96 yards. I think that's one of his best in his career after Marvin Harrison left the game with a concussion, like you said. But I think one of the more interesting parts about this game was, you know, Romeo Dobbs was suspended last week for essentially ditching practice. And Jair Alexander was talking about, he's like, I talked to him, he's like, "Everything's cleared up." I told him, I was like, "You're gonna score 2 touchdowns this week against the Cardinals," and sure enough, he did. He scored 2 touchdowns this week, and, just everything the Packers did this week, they played at a higher level and a higher expectation, and they wanted to win that game, where I felt like the Cardinals, I feel like after the first couple of scores, they kinda just gave up and called it quits, especially with all the injuries that happened. I mean, we saw Sean Murphy Bunting just get torched on one whole drive from pass interference to holding, and then finally cap it off with a touchdown against him. And then, injury with Bilal Nichols, kicker with Matt Prater not playing this week. And we'll talk more about both those players next week. And, just more injuries, more bad playing calls. So I was a little disappointed. I mean, looking at the rushing yard, like the rushing stats, 89 rushing yards for the team. James Conner, 3.4 yards per carry. Benson, 5.2 yards per carry. And it's something that you don't want to see this team where when something doesn't work, the team just falls apart. And I feel like a lot of teams, like when something doesn't work, they have a second option to rely on, where I feel like the Cardinals don't have that option to rely on. So unfortunately, I feel like Drew Petzing is in the hot seat after this game, and we'll see what happens in the Chargers game. But I feel like if the Cardinals lose to the Chargers, there may be some real possibilities that we could lose, valuable trade, valuable players to trades, whether it be Buda Baker or James Conner or whoever the case may be. I mean, there's some real possibility that we could trade those players for, capital in next year's trade or next year's draft, but it's just an unfortunate circumstance because we have the potential, we're just not using that potential.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to talk about potential. Moving on to the Cowboys and Lions, 47-9, that was the final score. Obviously a huge blowout by the Lions. And when it comes to the Cowboys, it just kind of makes you question what is going on. They just extended Dak Prescott, they gave him a big deal. And then obviously CeeDee Lamb is over there. And last season they did a really good job, and then moving on to this season, they aren't doing good at all, and it's going to be interesting to see kind of how they move on from this. Obviously they have some top defensive players, but really they just have not made any type of noise at all this season. And then obviously CeeDee Lamb got the extension after Dak Prescott, but things just seem to not be going good for the Cowboys, and it really does seem like in the next few seasons there's going to be maybe some rebuilding over there. But at the same time, it's like, what is, like, I don't even know what to say or think. All I know is that the Lions are doing good. Obviously they lost Aiden Hutchinson to a terrible knee injury. He underwent surgery that same day, and so that's going to be a huge loss for the Lions. But you can't take away from the rest of the team and the success that they have had.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring in, the Cowboys and, you know, how they performed last year in their, cap space with all the contract extensions and everything like that. But going back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the season when Dak got his extension is what are they gonna do with Micah Parsons? I mean, granted, Micah Parsons is injured this year, or I should say not this year, but this week. He suffered that injury going back a couple weeks with his, I think his ankle or his knee, one of the two. But just looking at how much of an impact he's had on that team so far, I mean, the Cowboys have been getting basically like they haven't been winning the games they need to. I mean, granted, they beat the Steelers last week or 2 weeks ago, I should say, but that was more of like a fluke because they barely won that game on a 4th and goal touchdown in like the final seconds of the game. But it's just like I feel like Jerry Jones is not making the correct decisions with extending certain players. And I feel like Micah Parsons, even with him being injured, is still one of those assets that you need back in the future. And we saw just how devastating this last free agency was for the Cowboys. I mean, Jerry Jones even talked about it. He said, I would have really liked to have Derrick Henry on the team as running back, but we couldn't afford him. And part of the reason is you're signing, Dak Prescott to NFL historic deals and you're giving CeeDee Lamb, top NFL wide receiver money, which I mean he rightfully deserves, but you have to make those decisions where you can only extend certain players. And I feel like signing Dak Prescott wasn't the smartest decision because now you have to, rely on him for the next however many years you signed him. I think it was like 4 or 5 years, but it really wasn't a great deal. And looking at this game, 2 picks, 0 touchdowns, not even 200 passing yards against this Detroit Lions defense, and it's not something you want to see. And even the rushing attack, I mean, the rushing attack's not there. Rico Dowles, ran for 25 yards. Ezekiel Elliott ran for 17, and it's just like nothing is working for this Cowboys defense. And you flip over to the Lions side. I mean, you have Montgomery, you have Gibbs, who both ran for over 50 yards. Montgomery scored 2 touchdowns, and then passing wise, St. Brown, Laporta, Williams all scored touchdowns. So it's like this: the Lions are definitely producing, and they definitely have a chance to win the Super Bowl this year with how they've been playing. But one of the key factors, like you mentioned, is, Laporta going out with an injury. And I think that kind of derails the whole situation with the Lions and having the chance to, you know, go further in the division. But maybe there could be some, you know, trades going on because we saw some trades happen this week, and we'll talk about that later. But there's talks that maybe the Lions could trade for, Max Crosby or, Hassan Reddick from the Jets. But, losing Aiden Hutchinson for the year was definitely a heartbreak for the Lions and definitely for the fan base just because you saw all the potential he had with the team, but it was one of those things where, he most definitely was gonna win defensive player of the year this year with how he was playing. I mean, leader in sacks, leader in pressure, best pass rush win rate against any team so far as a defensive line player, and just watching how he played, like, he knew how the game worked, and he was smart enough to see the field from where he was at on the line of scrimmage, but, you know, him not having a presence on that Lions defense is definitely gonna be something that a lot of teams are gonna be able to, breathe a sigh of relief, but, Lions definitely have their offense going, and I think just a trade away from, securing themselves from the first Super Bowl appearance.
Yeah, for sure. And then another thing that I kind of question is whether Mike McCarthy is on the hot seat. Now, I personally think he is. Obviously these last few seasons, this has been the question for a lot of people, and really nothing has happened from it. They keep him, and it kind of seems like that's just how it goes with Jerry Jones. Obviously, they kept Dak Prescott and then CeeDee Lamb, and obviously, Mike McCarthy, as I just mentioned, is still there. So it's going to be interesting to see if they move on from him. But in the future, do you think that they will continue with Mike McCarthy?
No. And I would even go as far as to say they clean house the entire coaching staff. I mean, Mike McCarthy, he's been decent. I mean, he's led the Cowboys to a couple of playoff appearances, but he hasn't successfully brought them to the championship level where they need to be. And then, you bring on Mike Zimmer, and Mike Zimmer just his whole defensive scheme just is not what it used to be, 5, 10 years ago. I think he's an outdated defensive coordinator. I think his defensive schemes just don't work anymore, and I wouldn't be surprised if both of them weren't coaches for the Cowboys next season.
Yeah, and it kind of brings up an interesting point as well because, you know, obviously he's been questioned for a lot of seasons, and then when you look at the Jets, which obviously we just saw Robert Saleh get fired, it kind of makes you wonder because the Jets came in this week and they looked like they would be able to take down the Bills. Obviously, if Williams caught the pass, they could have beat the Bills, but obviously things just didn't work out on the field. But when it comes to the staff, it kind of makes you wonder if maybe the problem was Salah, or was it the offensive coordinator, or who is the problem? Obviously, because when you look at the Cowboys, if you have players like CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott is a decent quarterback, I will say. He's not bad, he's not great, he's kinda in the middle. And when you have players like that, especially Micah Parsons, and obviously, as we mentioned, he's injured, but with players like that, there should be no question as to whether or not you're gonna win. And for the teams that they've been playing, there has been a few that they should have been able to win, and they just can't.
Yeah, and it's like going back to what you said with, you know, the Jets and their coaching staff. I feel like the Jets firing Saleh was more of a scapegoat because they fired Saleh and then they demoted Nathaniel Hackett from offensive coordinator. So, you know, seeing how the team played this week against the Bills, I mean, granted the Bills faced a lot of injuries on their defense, but they still played great. And, kickers just were atrocious this week. But you see how they played and, you know, how everything was developing, and you think, man, like Saleh was the issue, but I really feel like it was more of a scapegoat. And then you talk about, Parsons and how he fits in that defensive scheme with the Cowboys. But you have to think uh he just got his 5th-year option picked up. So he only has 2 more years left with this Cowboys. And I feel like, Jerry Jones is kind of screwing uh Micah Parsons, because he can play both linebacker and defensive end, and he chose the cheaper option where he's like, "Well, you're a defensive end, so we're gonna pay you like a defensive end," where he really plays, linebacker, defensive end, outside linebacker, wherever the case may be. But I don't feel like Mike Zimmerman. has the what's it called? I don't feel like he has the correct scheme for Parsons and, DeMarcus Lawrence and all those players that come to play. And, granted, some of those players are also injured, the 2 players I just mentioned, then you have Deron Bland, who is also injured and coming back from IR, but just I feel like there has to be some, you know, scheming and some networking between those players and getting players to come into your team that fit certain roles because working with the players you have now, I mean, it's getting you by, but it's not working to play, contending teams like the Lions. And we saw that this week. And unfortunately, I don't think either of those coaches are going to be there for changes that happen in the future.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, but anyways, moving on from that and somebody else who won't be there much longer, Devonte Adams. Let's move on to the Steelers Raiders. Obviously, the Steelers had a big win over the Raiders, 32-13, and this was a big one. The Steelers, obviously they've been playing really well and they've been led by Justin Fields, and it kind of makes you wonder again whether Justin Fields is actually a decent quarterback or if it's everybody around him kind of working together, or really what is the situation there, because you told me earlier before we got on the call that Mike Tomlin is going to be playing Russell Wilson this week and kind of getting him back in the groove and getting him in practice and things like that. So it's really interesting, obviously the Steelers, things have been working out right now. They're 4-2, and then when you look at the Raiders, it's just not so well. Obviously they're going through a rebuild right now, and Devontae Adams just got traded to the Jets. So it's going to be interesting. I really, I can't really project anything about either one of these teams just because, the Raiders obviously are not doing that well this season. And then obviously they just lost Devontae Adams. And then obviously on the Steelers side, they have been doing well, but is it a fluke, or are they actually a decent team?
The Steelers, I feel like they're an off and on team. They've had some good teams that they've faced and they've beaten, but they've also had some, crappy teams where they've lost. And it's kind of like, how do you lose to these teams? And, week 1, they beat the Falcons. I think that alone was a huge shock for a lot of people. You beat the Broncos. Broncos are decent. Chargers are playing decent. You lose to the Colts and the Cowboys in back-to-back weeks, and those are kind of shockers because Colts haven't been playing well. Cowboys have been playing, they're the Cowboys. And then you go out and well, I shouldn't say blow up, but you beat the Raiders. And you know, things have been looking great for the Steelers so far, and then, like you mentioned with Russell Wilson coming back, is that more of like a diversion for other teams to say like, "Hey, look, we have Russell Wilson and we have Justin Fields, like, which one are we gonna play this week? How are you gonna defend against either of these quarterbacks? Oh, maybe we could play both these quarterbacks, then how are you gonna defend against both?" So, it's a weird situation that I think Mike Tomlin likes to play around with as like a mind game just because, you know, we all like he was announced that Russell Wilson that was going to be the starter of the week 1, and for him to get injured from that calf injury week 1, sideline him for 6 weeks essentially, and now he's fully healthy, and now you want to see what Russell Wilson's potential is after going 4-2 with Justin Fields. I think, it's a little bit of a shock because you don't want to change what you already have in motion, but I could very well see Mike Tomlin using that as like a scheme, like I mentioned, where he's like, yeah, we have the chance we could play either of these quarterbacks, so scheme which one you want and pick your poison. But if he does end up choosing Russell Wilson to go out and play this week, I don't think that's a good call on his part because I feel like the team has, revolved around Justin Fields and how he's been playing. And granted, you go 3-0 and then you lose 2 back to back and then you beat the Raiders, which is a must-win game for Justin Fields. Um, I just don't like the decision to possibly put Russell Wilson back in the spot after being out, 6 weeks. And granted, I mean, we'll see how what happens this week later on in the week when they announce who the starters are, but you know, I feel like everything works better with Justin Fields. I mean, he's a better rushing quarterback than Russell Wilson. Granted, Wilson might be a better pocket passer, but when you have a struggling run game like the Steelers have, beside, this last game against the Steelers or against the Raiders, which the Raiders have had pretty awful rushing defense. You definitely need that option where you can take off the field, and especially with how quick Justin Fields is, I feel like he's the better option. And with George Pickens playing as well he is, all the players around the Steelers' offensive like receiving core, like they're all playing decent, but it's definitely something to look at. And the Steelers' defense are always great, whatever the case may be, and I feel like the Steelers' defense is what's going to carry them to a playoff if they even get that far. But I don't like the decision on moving on from Justin Fields with how everything's been going for them so far.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. And then not only that, but the last time we saw Russell Wilson, obviously he did not perform and there was a lot of interceptions thrown. So it's going to be interesting to see how he performs when he comes in to play this week for the Steelers. But I guess we'll just have to watch and find out. But moving on, another team that's going to be interesting to see how they perform this week, the Seahawks, after they lost 36-24 against the 49ers. Obviously, this one was an NFC West division rival game, and it was an interesting one. A lot of people kind of questioned whether the Seahawks could come in and take down the 49ers. Obviously, a lot of people believed that the 49ers would not lose this game after losing multiple games to some division rivals. And it was interesting because obviously Jordan Mason became injured during the game, and it was a crazy game. It was way closer than I thought it would be. Um, if these teams rematch, though, I wouldn't be surprised if the Seahawks came out with a win. But by the time that happens, if it happens, Christian McCaffrey will probably be back.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. I mean, this game was a lot closer than expected, and honestly, Seattle probably could have won this game had they not, shot themselves in the foot. I mean, DK Metcalf had two narrow touch or two what's the word? Close calls for touchdowns. I mean, to go in the half, he has that toe tap that just barely goes out of bounds. And then late in the fourth quarter, he gets that 50-yard touchdown that ends up getting called back because of an illegal shift on the offense. And, you know, those two touchdowns alone had they stood, you know, 14 points, they would be up 2 points against the 49ers and the 49ers would be down. I mean, the 49ers, we've seen in back-to-back games that they can go up, but it's a matter of holding that lead. And we saw that with the Rams, we saw it with the Cardinals, where they had the lead, but they just couldn't hold that lead, and then they fall apart and lose the games. And it almost happened this week or last week against Seattle. And, you know, Seattle wasn't playing spectacular, but they definitely played a lot better than I think a lot of people expected. And, their defense was definitely, dismantled from injuries. I mean, you still don't have Byron Young, you still don't have, uh Tariq Woolen, who are your two big cornerstones in that offense or in that defense, I should say. And you still play to a pretty well defensive level against the 49ers. But, you know, it was really just penalties that were shooting them in the foot. And like you said, with Jordan Mason going out with a shoulder injury early in the game, um, I said that I'm gonna say this, and I said this last year. Any running back that comes into Kyle Shanahan's offense is always gonna be good with the offensive line that they had, and we saw that with Isaac Guerendo, who, 10 carries for 99 yards, and granted, 76 of those yards came from that one rush that he had towards the end of the game where he slid down at the goal line. And, you see that, and you see, Patrick Taylor, who's been more of a receiving threat over Isaac Guerendo. But, if Jordan Mason can't play this week, I still don't think that they're gonna have a problem with Isaac Guerrero and Patrick Taylor taking over split carries because, like we saw countless times, their rushing attack is not the problem with the offensive line and how everything schemes around them. I mean, you still have Deebo Samuel, you still have George Kittle. Brandon Ayuk hasn't been playing great, but when he gets the targets, he plays great. Um, really, it's just a matter of what can they get going and when can they get going. Like you said, when the next time they meet, they might have Christian McCaffrey back depending on how late in the season it is and how much usage CMC is gonna get going back into that game. But yeah, I mean, 49ers are still a good team, but they have a lot to work on offensively.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, moving on to the week 7 matchups. We're going to get started with Thursday night football, the New Orleans Saints and Denver Broncos. This one's going to be interesting. Obviously we've seen Spencer Rattler come in for the Saints after Derek Carr's injury and then Bo Nix with the Broncos performing and showing that he can get it done. The Broncos have won 3 games this season but have also lost 3, and then obviously the Saints are 2-4. So this one's going to be an interesting one. It is in New Orleans. And right now I'm going to go with the Broncos just because I know that their defense is doing pretty well. And also their offense with Bo Nix is doing really well, especially with all of the injuries that were just announced today from New Orleans.
Yeah, and it's very significant injuries for the Saints. I mean, first you lose Olave from concussion, and we saw just how bad of a concussion he suffered last week against the Buccaneers. But now news has come out, and they said that Raheem Shaheed is now going to be needing surgery, and he's going to be out for quite some time. So there goes your top 2 receivers on the Saints. So now you have your backup quarterback with Spencer Rattler. You're going to be out your top 2 wide receivers. So now you're going to be focusing with tight ends and practice squad receivers, should I say. And a lot of this game is going to revolve around Alvin Kamara for the Saints offense. And, just looking at how the Saints defense has been playing, I mean, it has been playing spectacular. Where you look at the Broncos, they face some, tougher matchups and they've come out closer, have won some games against some pretty tough opponents. And, with how Bo Nix is progressing right now in the NFL, I mean, granted, he didn't start off the hottest, but he's definitely playing a lot better than a lot of people expected with this Broncos offense. And, like you said, the Broncos are 3-3. The Saints have lost 4 straight games. So I think the Broncos have a better chance of winning this game than the Saints do.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But moving on, we have the New England Patriots and Jacksonville Jaguars. This game's going to be early. And, you know, Drake May really did perform better than I thought he would for his first NFL game. The Patriots have lost 5 games this season. They've only won 1. And the same thing with the Jags, but you know, I think I'm gonna have to go with the Jags. Trevor Lawrence, he has more experience, and he has some good targets like Christian Kirk, and and then on the defensive side, they've been struggling a little bit this season, but I really think that they can get it done, especially after their loss against the Bears.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, Christian Kirk and their rookie pickup with Thompson Jr. and just with how things just have been progressing with the Jaguars. I mean, they won their first game against the Colts, which I mean, surprise, not surprise, I don't know. You guys decide, but just I feel like something isn't clicking with this team. Like you said, Christian Kirk, he's been a reliable target for Trevor Lawrence, and Etienne, he's been a serviceable running back for the team, but he's not going to be playing this week. He just went out with I think an ankle injury, so you're going to have Tank Bigsby taking over as the running back role, and Gabe Davis, who's been making somewhat of an appearance now. And, Evan Ingram coming back from injury, so there's a lot of things to look forward to for the Jaguars playing this game. The defense has been playing decent. You still have Joshua Hines Allen. You still have Trayvon Walker and that defense that has been building progressively, but I don't know, just looking at how Drake Mays played this last week against a much better team, I feel like, with the weapons that Drake Mays has and, with his ability to run the ball, pass the ball, and make opportunities, I would not be surprised if the Patriots won this game against the Jaguars. And, you know, I feel like a lot of it comes down to if Ramondre Stevenson does play this week, because he is questionable. But if he does play, I feel like that'll be a huge swing for the Patriots side because now you have a strong rushing attack with the Patriots offense going along with Drake Mays and his passing ability. Whereas before, Jacoby Brissett didn't really have that strong of a passing game. And a lot of it was revolving around Ramondre Stevenson and him having to run the ball. And unfortunately, overexerting his body and getting him injured, but I do feel like the Patriots have a chance to win this game against the Jaguars.
Yeah, and then moving on, the next game, obviously starting at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, it's the Seattle Seahawks versus the Atlanta Falcons. Obviously, this one's going to be an interesting game. I think it's going to be low scoring, and I think it's going to be a close one. But obviously the Seahawks lost last game to the 49ers. I could see them coming back, but at the same time, I think the Falcons are just too good of a team to fall to the Seahawks. And I think Kirk Cousins is just really making it work there in Atlanta. He has some great target options. Drake London, along with Darnell Mooney, and things just seem to be working out there in Atlanta. So I'm going to roll with the Falcons for this one, but I wouldn't be shocked if the Seahawks pulled off a win.
You know, the Falcons have been playing at a very great level, and I feel like a lot of it revolves around Kirk Cousins. We've seen him lead back-to-back wins. We've seen him, come back and shut out teams, playing the way he has and keeping it close for a lot of games. I mean, granted, you lose to the Steelers week 1, which I feel like was a fluke for the Steelers just because, Kirk Cousins wasn't necessarily, uh, situated for the Falcons at the time. And then you go back and beat the Eagles in a game-winning drive. You barely lose to the Chiefs with a questionable missed call. You beat the Saints with a field goal. You beat the Buccaneers in overtime. You smoked the Panthers, but I would not be shocked to say Seattle wins this game. And the reason I say this is because, if Byron Murphy comes back to play, if Tariq Woolen comes back to play, that's going to be one of the hardest secondaries that Kirk Cousins has seen since he's played the Steelers. And, not only the secondary, but the defensive line. I mean, that defensive line was tough against the 49ers, and we saw how they played against the 49ers defense and just how they revolved around, the passing attack. But it's going to be one of those games where Bijan Robinson needs to step up his game just a little bit to get something going. And I feel like they need to take some pressure off Kirk Cousins because if they don't, then there's going to be some turnovers that Kirk Cousins is going to make because this defense has been playing to a high standard. And, Smith, he's always playing from behind. And I do think that, you know, Kenneth Walker is going to have some big, runs against the Falcons defense, but I think a lot of it's going to revolve around passing attack like it usually does for Seattle. I mean, DK Metcalf is going to be your big guy going against, AJ Terrell and, with everything going like that, but it's going to be, quick passes. It's not going to be, play actions with Kenneth Walker, every rushing attack here and there, but I think Seattle's going to pull off a win, and I think they're due for a win, especially after losing 3 straight, in 11 days where you lose to the Detroit Lions, you lose to the Detroit Lions, you lose to the New York Giants, and you lose to the San Francisco 49ers. And, with the Falcons winning back-to-back-to-back divisional games, I do feel like, coming into the NFC West, they are going to have a little bit of a struggle.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But moving on, the Tennessee Titans taking on the Buffalo Bills. Obviously, I'm going to roll with the Bills. I cannot imagine them losing to the Titans. The Titans have just been performing really terribly this season. And it's very interesting to me because I really didn't think that they would be playing as bad as they are. Obviously with Ryan Tannehill a few seasons ago, they played pretty good and, you know, they have a good roster. I think they're just missing something, and I honestly think that it could be with relating to the coaching staff. I'm not sure, but I just know that Will Levis is not the guy that you would want to have in the circle if that was your team. And when it comes to the Bills, everything seems to be going right for them with their defense, and DeMar Hamlin has been playing incredible. And then obviously Josh Allen just kind of connecting with his targets. It was released that the Bills were actually trying to bring Davante Adams over, but they just didn't have enough money for the contract that he would want. So, obviously the Bills have Khalil Shakir, and then they just picked up Amari Cooper. So a huge trade, and it's going to be interesting to see how well they play, especially now with Amari Cooper. So, anyways, for this game, I'm going to take the Bills.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point with the trade that happened earlier this week with Amari Cooper. So going back to the Devonte Adams and Amari Cooper trades that took place on Monday, you look at, or on Tuesday, I should say, you look at what the situation was. The Bills really wanted to keep Devonte Adams away from the Jets at all time. And with the Raiders situation that they've had with Devonte Adams, I think the Raiders just wanted to completely get rid of Devonte Adams. They didn't want to take on any of his contract that he signed for. They didn't want to, have any part of him on the team. And I think they had good reasons because, he said he has a hamstring injury. He hasn't played 2 straight games, gets traded to the Jets, and now he's immediately practicing with Aaron Rodgers, which, granted, I mean, that's his decision. I mean, there's not really anything else you can say about that. But it was interesting because, like you said, the Bills did try to trade for Devonte Adams, and they just didn't want his contract because the Raiders were initially asking for a third-round pick with 100% contract going to whatever team traded for him. And the Bills wanted to give him a third-round pick with 60% of the contract going to them rather than full 100%. And the Raiders just weren't taking that. They wanted a conditional third round pick with 100% of the contract gone, so they didn't have to deal with any of it. So, you know, Bills backed out and, beat the Jets on Monday Night Football. And I think that's where things kind of went into motion where the Jets were like, hey, we'll overpay for that. We'll give you conditional third round pick for Devontae Adams to take on his whole contract because, they want to make Aaron Rodgers happy. So you go on from that, and the Bills, look for the second best option with Amari Cooper. So they go, okay, here, we'll give you a third and seventh round pick next year for Amari Cooper and a sixth round pick for this year. And, the Browns, with the situation they're in, they're like, cool, we'll take that offer. So I think the Bills definitely came out with the better hand on both those trades just because Amari Cooper's contract's not super expensive. They gave up, similar stocks of what they would have given up for Devontae Adams. But, going into this game, I think with the Titans defense playing the way it is and the offense playing the way it is, and you add on the Bills offense with the acquisition of Amari Cooper, there's really no way that the Bills lose this game. I mean, Will Levis, I think he's expected to come back to play this week, and just how he played, it hasn't been spectacular. And you barely lose to the Colts, and just it hasn't been pretty for Titan fans, and I wouldn't be shocked to say, that they just tank for the rest of the season and just go for a future pick just to, find something to move on for. But, this roster's old. It's not helping out, nothing's coming to fruition like they expected. Where the Bills side, they have young players. Their team is definitely built chemistry after losing so many players, and they're playing at a high contender level. So I'm expecting the Bills to pull off a win this week.
Yeah, I really can't imagine the Bills losing. But anyways, moving on, the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cleveland Browns. Obviously the Browns just traded away Amari Cooper, and that team has just been kind of struggling. And I wouldn't even say kinda. They've been struggling a lot. So, Anyways, I'm gonna roll with the Cincinnati Bengals. Obviously, their defense hasn't been playing too well, but I think it's time that they win. They've only won 2 games this season. They've lost 4, and the Browns, they've lost 5, won 1. So I got to go with Cincinnati. I think Joe Burrow is going to be able to get it done this week with T. Higgins. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think the Bengals will get it done this week against the Browns. And like you said, the Browns have just been absolutely horrendous. And I think, a lot of it falls on ownership with them not wanting to bench Sean Watson because I really don't feel like Kevin Stefanski wants to keep rolling with Deshaun Watson because it's more of just a smack on the face to the fan base and the team, like, hey, like we're gonna roll with this guy, even though he's been playing really, really bad. But I feel like with the contract, and I said this last week, I feel like with the contract that Deshaun Watson has, they kind of have to play him just because it's so much money, even though he's not playing at a level that they want them to play. But the Browns have just been slowly deteriorating, like you said. Just lost Amari Cooper. Jerome Ford's not going to play this week, so there's been a lot of you know missing pieces. But good news for Browns fans is Nick Chubb is going to play this week, so it's going to be how does he perform against this Bengals defense, and how is he going to affect this game? Because coming back from almost a year and a half of not playing football, having to rehab your leg from all the different leg injuries that you suffered from week two's game last year, and just, not experiencing football for quite some time. I think he's going to be off to a slow start, but I wouldn't be shocked if, you know, Nick Chubb came out firing out of the gate just because he's that much of a football player. But I do think, the Bengals are going to win this game, but I would not be surprised if Nick Chubb made it a close game.
Yeah, and then obviously moving on, we have the Houston Texans and the Green Bay Packers. The Texans obviously played really well last week with Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell. Nico Collins isn't on that list anymore. He's on the IR, so going to be a few games without him. But don't worry because Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs can get it done, and then obviously Joe Mixon came back. So that looks good for Houston, but on the other side with the Packers, obviously they have Jordan Love and then Josh Jacobs, but I got to go with the Texans. I just think that they are too good of a team, especially with Will Anderson on the defensive side, in order to lose to the Packers. So I'm rolling with the Texans and CJ Stroud for this one. I hope they don't let me down.
I'm gonna have to disagree. I'm gonna go with the Packers. And you know, watching the Packers play with Jordan Love compared to Malik Willis is like night and day. Jordan Love has the capability to take this team far if he plays well, and we've seen that time and time again. And we've seen how he throws the ball. Granted, he was out weeks 2 and 3 with a MCL sprain, but he came back and he is competing like an MVP caliber quarterback. And we've seen it time and time again. I mean, he almost beat the undefeated Vikings, you know, almost he beats the Rams, destroys the Cardinals, and his really only loss came from the Eagles in week 1 where his MCL sprain did happen. So this team could very well be undefeated if it wasn't for, a couple of, Russ coming out from the Vikings and, the MCL sprain going against the Eagles. But with how everything's been forming for the Green Bay Packers, their chemistry, how everything's been developing, Matt LaFleur designing the offense the way it is, I feel like, everything is designed for Jordan Love to succeed. And I'm not saying, the Texans are a bad team. I mean, we've seen, CJ Stroud show MVP caliber talent. Joe Mixon, like you mentioned, Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell and, all those players on the offensive side of the ball. But not having Nico Collins, I feel like, is a huge loss for that offense just because the Packers defense is definitely a lot better than it is on paper. And we definitely saw it the last couple of weeks. And, nothing against the Texans defense with, Derek Stingley, Kamari Lassiter and, Will Anderson and all of them. But I do feel like, the Packers have the better talent on their team than the Texans do, just based off what we've seen last couple of weeks. So I'm gonna stick with the Packers.
Yeah. I could see the Packers winning. And you bring up a good point saying that they could be undefeated. I have to agree with you on that one, especially since Jordan Love got injured during the game overseas. Obviously, I've heard, that a lot of people don't like playing overseas because of their field conditions. But, anyways, moving on, the Miami Dolphins taking on the Indianapolis Colts. And this one brings up an interesting topic. It kind of makes me wonder, is Tua going to come back or not? Obviously, there's been some talk that he will, there's been some talk that he isn't. And it brings up an interesting point, and it kind of brings up the conversation of the Guardian caps. And I've seen a lot of people been putting on those Guardian caps during the games. And, good for them. I want to say good for them because obviously the contact that their head takes throughout the season can be very, very harmful to them. And then when they put those Guardian caps on, they've done some studies that have kind of made it seem like they are helpful. So, anyways, it's going to be interesting to see if Tua comes back. But for this game, I have to go with, you know, I really want to go with Indianapolis just because Joe Flacco, and we know how successful he can be. He came off the couch last season and led the Browns into the playoffs. So it's going to be interesting, and that also brings up a point. Obviously the Browns last season did phenomenal with Joe Flacco, and then now look at them, 1-5 with Deshaun Watson, who they gave a huge contract to. So very shocking. But anyways, when it comes to the Colts with Jonathan Taylor and Michael Pittman, you know, something is telling me to go with the Colts, so I'm gonna take the Colts.
You know, this game I feel like is a trap game for the Colts, and the reason I say this is because the Dolphins just haven't been performing at the level that they should be, and they squeak out a bye against, or they squeak out a win against the Patriots, which I feel like they shouldn't have won that game, and then they beat the Jaguars week 1 off a comeback field goal to win the game, but you know Devon Achane has been playing great, Tyreek Hill has been playing great, Jalen Waddle has been playing great, and granted that just might be from quarterback play. I mean, you have Tyler Huntley as the starting quarterback, and I think he's going to be the starting quarterback until Tua Tagovailoa comes back from IR. But it's going to be the question of when does he come back? Because I think Mike McDaniels has come out and said he's going to come back and play some point this season. It's just a matter of when. I think they said they're projecting week 8, which is against the Cardinals, which would be unfortunate for Cardinal fans. But I don't know. It's an interesting point of the game because Joe Flacco might not even play this game. I've heard that Anthony Richardson has been practicing. He might take the starting role back depending on how he progresses through practice. But it's going to be one of those weird situations where if Anthony Richardson comes back, I feel like it's going to be more of a split decision for the Miami Dolphins just because Anthony Richardson hasn't been that great of a pocket passer, but we've seen Joe Flacco come out and make some great plays. I mean, he's a touchdown ratio of 7-1 right now, and he's been playing great by all means, but it's just a matter of who's going to be playing starting quarterback this week. Is it going to be Richardson? Is it going to be Flacco? And I feel like playing Flacco this week gives the Colts a better chance to win. So if the Colts do play Flacco, I'm going to roll with the Colts. But if they play with Richardson, I'm going to have to roll with the Dolphins.
Yeah, this one's gonna be interesting, and I don't even know what to think, really. But anyways, moving on to the Detroit Lions and Minnesota Vikings. This is also going to be an interesting one. Except I think this is going to be the game that the Vikings just kind of fall, and so I'm going to take The Lions, obviously, the Lions are without Aiden Hutchinson after a terrible injury that he suffered. Except they have Jared Goff, who connects with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, who's been picking up the pace. And then obviously they have David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, who have just been running up and down the field. And then when you look at the Vikings, obviously their defense playing phenomenal. And then, they have some offensive weapons, but, it's hard to trust in Sam Darnold. And, he's got it done this far. They haven't lost any games. But, I think this is the one that they're going to lose.
Yeah, and like I always say, divisional games are always hard, and just just especially with the NFC North. I mean, every team in the NFC North is have above 500 right now, but I don't know. Like the the Vikings have been playing great so far, and granted, I think a lot of it relies on the Vikings defense, but you can't knock and say Sam Darnold hasn't been playing great either because he, 11 touchdowns, 4 interception, almost 1,200 passing yards in the first 6 games of the season. I mean, those are really great numbers you want to see. And, you know, he's definitely been getting his receivers involved, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, you know, he's been getting Jalen Naylor involved. And it's great to see what he's been able to produce with the receiving core that he has. Aaron Jones has been producing, but he didn't play last week. So it's going to be up in the air to see how the rushing attack goes. Where, Jared Goff, he's been, playing great at a good level too, but, 8 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. So not nearly the touchdown production ratio like Sam Darnold, but, he has two great running backs with Montgomery and Gibbs. Williams has been playing great. Brown has been playing great. Laporte has been picking up the slack. Tim Brown, who's been playing decent for this team as a free agent pickup. But I think a lot of it's going to come down to how this defense plays. And unfortunately, with the loss of Aiden Hutchinson, who broke his tibia in the process of sacking Dak Prescott this last week, I think is really going to hinder the Lions' chances of winning this game. Where we've seen the Vikings defense come in and out and turn over the ball. I think they turn over the ball every game against teams that they played against, and I wouldn't be shocked if they came out this week and put Jared Goff in a situation where he turn over the ball. Because, like I mentioned before, Jared Goff does not play well under pressure, and we've seen that time and time again. I think Brian Flores knows this, so he's going to make some really confusing packages with blitzing. He's going to make up some crazy blitzing designs. He's going to play some weird coverages against Jared Goff where it's going to work just because he needs to get that pressure on him to force the turnovers. Now, for the rushing attack, I think Montgomery and Gibbs is going to be the hardest pressure for the Vikings to take off because necessarily the Vikings defense isn't focused on, the running attack. I think they're more focused on the passing attack, but get Jared Goff into those long situations, I think they could get a couple turnovers. So I'm going to roll with the Vikings this week.
Okay, moving on, the Philadelphia Eagles taking on the New York Giants. Obviously, the Giants have been picking up the pace, and I haven't heard of anybody being rude to Daniel Jones lately because he's been playing great. So, anyways, when it comes to this game, I gotta go with the Eagles. Malik Neighbors didn't play last week; he was injured, and then obviously the Eagles have AJ Brown back, and then they also have Jalen Hurts, and he's been leading the team pretty well. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, especially with Dallas Goedert and the rest of the Eagles offense. Honestly, I think if the Eagles don't perform well, and right now they have a record of 3-2, if they don't keep on performing and winning games, honestly, I think Nick Sirianni could be on the hot seat. But this game's going to be in New York. Even still, I got to go with the Eagles.
Yeah, and looking at this game, I mean, like I said, divisional matchups. I think the Eagles are going to take this game. I do, however, think it's going to be a close game. And, Malik Neighbors should be back this game against the Eagles, which will make wide receiver matchups extremely difficult against this Eagles defense. And I mean, granted, the Eagles secondary hasn't been horrible, but it hasn't been playing well either. I mean, we've seen Cooper DeSheen make his first start last week. We saw, just how they came out and played against the Browns, and it wasn't really great to see how they played against, this Browns or offense, but, Quinyon Mitchell's definitely made himself as a starting corner against in this team. So it's gonna be nice seeing a rookie matchup with, Quinyon Mitchell and Malik Neighbors, but the Giants still have Wan'Dale Robinson, they still have Darius Slayton, Devin Singletary should be back, but I think putting pressure on Daniel Jones, and we saw us last week against the Bengals. I think putting pressure on Daniel Jones is going to cause a lot of turnovers where, Jalen Hurts has kind of been in favor of the pressure and taking on that for himself. So I do think the Eagles are going to win this game, but I do think it's going to be a hard fought matchup.
Yeah, but moving on, the Las Vegas Raiders taking on the Los Angeles Rams. And I have to go with the Rams on this one. I think that there's just been too much going on when it comes to the Raiders side, and that involves their coach, and then it also involves Devontae Adams getting traded. And another question has been whether or not Max Crosby will get traded, and you can talk about that. Except, for this game, I got to go with the Rams with Matthew Stafford. It's going to be interesting, especially when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua come back. Obviously, a few years ago they made it to the Super Bowl and then they just kind of fell apart. Except they have the players, they have them, but they're just, I don't know what's going on. They've only won one game, the Raiders won two, and honestly, I think it's just a mix of things. They lost Aaron Donald due to retirement, and then Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp on the IR. So a lot of their players who really made that impact are just not on the field. But, I think Sean McVay is a good coach. I think he's going to find a way to get it done, especially because the game is going to be in Los Angeles. So it's going to be an interesting one. But, you know, upsets can always happen.
Yeah. You know, looking at this game, I don't think it's going to be anything exciting. I do think, the Rams are going to pull out a win just because the Raiders defense is horrible against the run. And we've seen Kerwin Williams, make some outstanding plays on the run and on the pass, but I can't see the Raiders, being able to play against this Rams defense with how they've been playing, Byron Young, you still have Jared Verse, you still have, Fisk, who's been playing great, you still have Turner, who's been playing great. So I don't think the Raiders stand much of a chance against this Rams team. Granted, the Rams are 1-4, but record doesn't always tell how great a team is. And, just looking at how this team's been performing so far, without Puka and without Cup. And granted, Cup might be back this week depending on how his workouts go this week. So there's a chance, we might see him back, but it's gonna be one of those weird situations where if he's not back, how much is it gonna change? Unfortunately, I don't think it's gonna change that much. I think the Rams are still gonna win this game. Aiden O'Connell at quarterback against the Rams defensive line, it's not gonna really change much. So I do think the Rams are gonna win this game.
Yeah, and then moving on, the Carolina Panthers going to Washington, D.C. to take on the Washington Commanders. Obviously, Jaden Daniels came into the league. His rookie season, he's been putting up some numbers, and he has been doing really well with Terry McLaurin, and then obviously Austin Eckler and Brian Robinson. So it's going to be an interesting one. Obviously, Bryce Young was benched a few weeks ago, and then that brought in Andy Dalton. So it's going to be interesting. Obviously, I got to go with Washington. I think Jaden Daniels is doing a great job. They've won 4 games, they've only lost 2, and the Commanders are on pace to do something they have not done in a long time, which is make the playoffs. Obviously they've had some tough times, and then they got the new ownership group, and things just are seeming to work out over there. They they announced that they would be building a new stadium in a few years, and things are changing there in Washington. And you can't help but be happy for them, and especially Jaden Daniels with all of the things that he's been doing. Now, there's still some work that needs to be done on the defensive side, but they're getting it done regardless. So I got to go with Washington. Um, and I'm sure you're probably going to go with Washington as well.
Yeah, I'm going with Washington in this game, and you nailed it straight on the head. I mean, the Panthers are just in a position where they're just in no chance of, playing for the playoffs or no chance of playing for anything but pride at this point. I feel like them playing to win is more hurting them than helping them, especially, with Andy Dalton playing, who's not going to be much of your franchise quarterback, where the Commanders, Jaden Daniels been playing at MVP level straight out of the gate. Brian Robinson's been performing well as a running back for this game. You're getting Terry McLaurin involved with the passing tag. Zach Ertz been playing like he's in his prime. And just everything working out for the Commanders right now with how I don't wanna say how far out this team is because 'cause they're not that inexperienced of a team, but they're definitely not what you would see from a playoff contender team, but they definitely have the potential to make it far if they go to the playoffs. So, I'm gonna stick with the Commanders this game against the Carolina Panthers. I don't think the Panthers stand a chance against this Washington team.
Yeah, and then moving on, the Kansas City Chiefs traveling to San Francisco to take on the San Francisco 49ers and Brock Purdy. Obviously the Chiefs are undefeated. They just came off of a bye week, and now they're going to face the 49ers, who took down a division rival Seattle last week. So, going to be an interesting one. They're at Levi's Stadium, you know, but I got to go with Patrick Mahomes. It's hard to go against him. He is doing a great job, but at the same time this season, he has had a few interceptions, unlike him, but he still finds a way to win, and the team obviously has a great defense. So, really, it's a no-brainer. And then when you look at the 49ers, obviously they have a great defense with Nick Bosa, Fred Warner, except it's kind of hard because if the Chiefs offensive line doesn't hold, it's going to be hard for Mahomes, but I think he'll still find a way to work around it. He does good when he runs off to scramble, and then he just finds a play. And if he doesn't, he runs. So it's going to be interesting. And then obviously the 49ers now without Jordan Mason, I don't know if he'll be back for the game. He may be. And then obviously Christian McCaffrey still on the IR. So gonna be interesting to see what happens. Um, George Kittle always seems to find a way to make some plays, and Brandon Ayuk has been off and on. Obviously you can talk about that. And then Debo Samuel, he's been doing pretty well. So it's gonna be an interesting one there in San Francisco, but I gotta roll with the Chiefs.
Yeah, Super Bowl matchup, like you mentioned, it's gonna be a close game. I would say the Chiefs pull off the win just because we've seen, like I mentioned earlier, the Niners have leads and then fail to keep those leads ahead. But it would be something where we see something like that happen and, hopefully, the Niners might be able to pull something together and give the Chiefs their first upset. But, you know, with Kareem Hunt coming into play, now Clyde Edwards-Helaire being active for this game, or he should be active for this game, and with Juju Smith-Schuster making his impact, and just how everything's been clicking for this 49ers team. Granted, Mahomes has been playing great, but they've still been getting the wins on the road, at home, whatever the case may be. I just everything on paper for the Chiefs doesn't scream win, but with how they've been playing so far, they've been pulling wins so freaking close to every single team that I would not be shocked if the Niners went up and then lost the game at the very end, like, they did with the Cardinals, like they did with the Rams. So for that reason, And, with Jordan Mason, with his shoulder injury and, with all the injuries that the Niners have faced so far, I'm gonna stick with the Chiefs this game.
Yeah, and you gotta take note that the Chiefs are also coming off of a bye week, so they're gonna be energized. I'm sure they've been working for this one, especially because it's a Super Bowl rematch. And I'm a little disappointed that the NFL put this game at 1 o'clock rather than Sunday Night Football. But for Sunday Night Football, we're gonna see the New York Jets and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously two teams that have been in the spotlight with Aaron Rodgers coming in and taking over as quarterback. Obviously, last season he got hurt at the beginning of the season and then spent the rest of the season just recovering. And then he came in and, obviously they just traded for Devontae Adams. It's going to be interesting to see. I'm sure they're trying to get Devontae Adams on the same page very quickly. Obviously, um, they were not able to win against the Bills, but I'm sure that they are hungry. How can you not be when you've only won 2 games this season and you have a future Hall of Fame quarterback leading your team? And, obviously with the whole coaching situation, that's a mess itself. And then obviously on the other side with the Steelers, they're going through a mess that we spoke about earlier with Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, but at the same time, they still have TJ Watt. And it seems like the Jets' offensive line has a hard time holding, and they're about to be faced against TJ Watt. So it's going to be an interesting one. It's hard to go against future Hall of Famers, especially when they are in the position of quarterback. So, I don't know. But at the same time, Mike Tomlin, the coach of the Steelers, is a mastermind. So, I got to go with the Steelers. I think that whether it is Justin Fields or Russell Wilson, which right now it's obviously leaning towards Russell Wilson, I think that they will be able to get away from the Jets defense if the offensive line can't hold. Aaron Rodgers, he's not very fast, so I got to go, I think I have to go with the Steelers.
This one is a split for me. I really don't know who to pick. I mean, the Jets, they just traded for Devontae Adams, like we keep saying. So that itself changes the whole offensive dynamic in itself. Obviously Adams and Rodgers have had that connection in Green Bay for quite a couple of years. But like you mentioned, the Steelers defense is just out of this. I shouldn't say out of this world, but they're definitely playing at like a top 10 defensive team with, TJ Watt, like you mentioned, with Billy Porter Jr., with Cameron Hayward, and with all of the defensive players that they have. So looking at the Jets offensive line, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see TJ Watt make a huge impact on this game or Cameron Hayward make a huge impact on this game. It's gonna be one of those games where it's gonna be fought, or the game's gonna be won at the trench with offense and defensive line. And, I feel like the Steelers have both a better offensive line and a better defensive line compared to the Jets. So I'm gonna give this game to the Steelers. However, I would not be shocked if, the connection between Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers won them this game. So take that. I will say I roll with the Steelers, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Jets came out and beat them.
Yeah, but at the same time, we can't count Terrell Austin out, the Steelers defensive coordinator. He has been doing great. Obviously, he's in his second season with the Steelers, and we cannot count it out. He, I'm sure, is preparing to have the defensive players on Devontae Adams at all time and maybe even two people, but it's going to be interesting. And I think another player that maybe they should be watching out for, maybe Alan Lazard, but at the same time, obviously, I don't think that they're going to be benching Garrett Wilson. So, with that being said, I kind of think that obviously Devontae Adams is filling the spot of Alan Lazard. And then Williams, he did not catch the pass in the game against the Bills, which caused them to lose. And it was just reported by Adam Schefter that he will now be most likely being traded away to who knows who. but he is a trade option. So it's going to be an interesting one. But Terrell Lawson, I think, has all bases covered when it comes to Devontae Adams, and I'm sure Mike Tomlin has been on him about it all week long. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I think that maybe the Steelers defense needs to pay attention to Garrett Wilson, Alan Lazard, and whoever else, more compared to Devontae Adams.
Yeah, no, and you bring up a good point. I mean, the Steelers definitely know what they're doing with players that they have. It's just when you play against players who have that chemistry, that they've had chemistry for a long time, I feel like that chemistry is, something that you can rely on in the game where, it's a critical third down or, a critical must need touchdown. And, I feel like that connection is definitely something where it's like, hey, I know what you're gonna do. Just let me know when. And I think we've seen that countless times with Adams and Rodgers in Green Bay. So maybe something will change, but like you said, the Steelers defense is definitely playing better. And like I said earlier, I think, Steelers defense is definitely going to be taking them to where they want to be in the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. And then obviously moving on to Monday, it's going to be a great game with the Baltimore Ravens and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers have been playing phenomenal. And, Baker Mayfield, could he be a potential MVP winner? We don't know, but we will find out at the end of the season. He's been playing like one, and, well, despite the interceptions that he threw last week. But anyways, the Buccaneers have been playing really, really good with Bucky Irving and then Mike Evans and Chris Godwin and then Kate Otten. And then they all obviously have Vita Vea on the defensive side. You know, it's really going to be an interesting game, especially because Lamar Jackson with Derrick Henry and obviously Mark Andrews kind of got back maybe into his rhythm last game that the Ravens played. So it's going to be an interesting one. This game's going to be in Tampa Bay, and I really don't know who to go with because I think both teams are really good. And they're both tied when it comes to their overall record. They're both 4-2. But I think I have to go with the Ravens. I have a hard time going against Derrick Henry, and obviously they have they have John Harbaugh.
Yeah, and just looking at this game, like you mentioned, Derrick Henry, Lamar Jackson, Zay Flowers. I don't think this Buccaneers defense is ready for the rushing attack. And we saw this previously with the Broncos. I mean, the Broncos blew them out of the water. I think they won, what was it, like 24-7 or something ridiculous like that. And, having, like I said, Derrick Henry, who's been an absolute monster so far on the ground, is definitely something the Buccaneers should be worried about. But on the flip side, the Ravens secondary hasn't been playing that great. And, you bring up, Mike Evans, you bring up Chris Godwin, Cade Otton, Bucky Irving, the emergence of Sean Tucker. I don't it's gonna be one of those high scoring games offensively. And I feel like the last person who gets the ball is gonna win the game. And with that being said, I do think the Ravens are gonna pull out a win just because they've definitely pulled themselves together, like you said, with Jim Harbaugh or John Harbaugh, I should say, coming together, making things happen and showing that, they're not scared to pass the ball, not scared to run the ball with all the weapons that they have. And we clearly saw that last week against the Commanders where, you know, Lamar was making plays left and right against the Commanders team and, snuck out a win against the Commanders. But I wouldn't be surprised if, the Buccaneers put in a fight, but I'm gonna stick with the Ravens this week.
Yeah, and then obviously our favorite game of the week, the Los Angeles Chargers traveling to Arizona State Farm Stadium to take on the Arizona Cardinals. Now, this one's going to be interesting, especially because the Cardinals had a rude awakening last week against the Packers. So it's going to be an interesting one, especially Kyler Murray getting back into his rhythm and the way that he obviously has shown that he can perform. He's been doing a great job this season, but the defense not so much. And obviously with Marvin Harrison being out with a concussion, I think that he'll have enough time to recover by then. But at the same time, it kind of puts into question. And then another thing too is that obviously, Trey McBride and Elijah Higgins and James Conner, it was really hard for them last week. So it's hard to say their status because we didn't see a lot of them. The Packers really just controlled that game. But I think they could take down the Chargers. I think that it's going to be a good game. And I really think that Arizona will win this one.
I feel like this is a must-win game for the Cardinals, and I said this at the very beginning. If the Cardinals don't win this game, I feel like there's going to be a ton of players on the trade block for draft capital. Like I said, Buda Baker, James Conner, you know, players like that who have potential to be good elsewhere. But, you know, both of these teams are in situations where they need to win this game for, division, for playoffs, whatever the case may be. And, the Cardinals, they're undefeated in the division right now, 2-0, both against the Rams and the 49ers. So there is potential for the Cardinals to still make the playoffs at 2-4. And, the Chargers, playing as great as they are with the running attack that they have. I mean, it really is something to see with a wild card spot possibly, but I feel like a lot of the Chargers defense is going to revolve around, the running attack with J.K. Dobbins, the offensive line with Joel and Rashawn Slater, and, Justin Herbert, who hasn't been playing spectacular, but, he's been making stuff done with what he has. And, he pulled off a win against the Broncos last week. But this is going to be one of those games where if either of these teams lose, it's going to be where they're going to be giving up players for draft capital in the future just because they're at that point of the season where, these middle of the year games matter. And if you can't get stuff done now, you might as well just call it and hang up the gloves for now. But, Cardinals are hopefully going to get back, Darius Robinson, who's been on IR since the beginning of the season with a calf strain. They're going to get back Zay Flowers, or not Zay Flowers, Zay Jones, who is a definite veteran presence for this Cardinals team. And like you said, Marvin Harrison, who might not play this week with a concussion. And there's going to be some questions there. But, Trey McBride definitely stepped up his game, like you mentioned, 87 yards, 8 catches. So, or 98 yards, my mistake. But it's going to be one of those games where there needs to be more involvement with the passing attack for the Cardinals and the Chargers. Just because, you know, we saw how the Cardinals shut down Jordan Mason last or 2 weeks ago against the 49ers. Could they do the same against the Chargers? There's a possibility, but then you have to focus on, the passing attack with Lad McConkey, DJ Chalk, who I think just got activated off IR, but focusing on that. And the Cardinals, with Marvin Harrison not possibly playing, you're gonna have Zay Jones, who is a little bit rusty, getting him into the lineup, throwing him in the game like that. Michael Wilson, who's been stepping up in as the wide receiver one. Trey McBride, like you mentioned. So this is going to be a close game, but I think the Cardinals are going to pull it off. Game at home, Monday Night Football spotlight. I think the Cardinals need to get this done. I think this game means more for them than it does for the Chargers.
Yeah, for sure. And, I'm going to ask you something. If the Cardinals don't pull off the win, especially against the Chargers, do you think Drew Petzing could be on the hot seat?
I think he's on the hot seat already with how he's been performing. A lot of Cardinal fans have been, quite upset with how things have been progressing, with the running attack, with how little involvement Marvin Harrison Jr. is getting. not focusing on the passing attack when we have the receivers there. I mean, we saw Trey McBride almost have 100 yards last week against the Packers. We've seen flashes of Marvin Harrison and how good he can be. Granted, he's still, filling in that role as a number one receiver. So there is some question there, but it's definitely not out of the question for, him to make decision with Jonathan Gannon, making the decision, pulling the plug from Drew Petzing and changing offensive coordinators with whoever else it might be. Because we've seen Nick Rallis, the defensive coordinator, he's definitely made work with the defense that's been given to him. And, you shut out the 49ers in the second half, you shut out the Lions in the second half. So he's definitely there to stay. You give him, better defensive options and he's going to make stuff happen where, Drew Petzing, I feel like he has the capability. He's just not utilizing them correctly. So I do think Drew Petzing is in the hot seat. I do feel like if the Cardinals do lose this game, there's going to be some questions on if they need to hire a new offensive coordinator. And, it's going to be hard this week because, Matt Prater was just moved to the IR after suffering a knee injury in the practice of week 5 over the 49ers. So he's going to be out. They have Chad Ryland, who's been activated to kicker. And on top of that, with the defensive side, you have Bilal Nichols, who just went out with a stinger and now is on IR as well. So there's going to be some huge questions there with how the team's going to perform without those players. But definitely, I do think Drew Petzing is in the hot seat with how the offense has been playing so far.
Yeah, and then obviously we've said it over and over, Devontae Adams was traded to the Jets. Some other trades that have happened, Texas running back. Some other trades that have happened, the Texans running back Cam Akers was traded to the Minnesota Vikings again for a 2026 conditional 6th rounder. I think this will be good for them, but it's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, and the trade, I think a lot of people were speculating that, maybe this was the end of Ty Chandler and, his role as the backup, but apparently Kevin O'Connell has come out and said, it's not going to change much. I think it's more of a depth role, but I can't see Cam Akers, taking over more as a backup splitting, the splitting snaps with Ty Chandler. And then on top of that, earlier this week, the Jaguars traded defensive tackle Roy Robertson Harris for Seattle for a next year 6th rounder. So, Seattle, I think they're more preparing for, Byron Murphy, who might be out a little bit longer than expected, but there's going to be some question with that. And, going back to the injuries, like we mentioned with everything going on, one of the bigger injuries that's happened for the Giants is their franchise offensive tackle, Andrew Thomas, is has suffered a serious foot injury against the Bengals, and he is now looking to have season-ending surgery to get his foot repaired. So that's a huge loss for the Giants against, the Eagles, who have a pretty good pass rush. And on top of that, with the Broncos, Patrick Surtain has been ruled out for a concussion, so he will not be playing this week. So, granted, it's not going to play much of a factor because the Saints are going to be without Olave and Shaheed. So there's going to be some not so worrisome, decisions there. But I think that's going to do it this week for the Alex Entire podcast. Make sure to stay up to date with everything going on our YouTube channel. We'll post some stuff on Instagram. Check us out there. But for now, that's all for this week. So check us out, and we'll see you guys next week.